So the next chapter is treaty settlement land. So the title of this chapter is very specific. It focuses on the land that will actually be transferred to the First Nation or given control to the First Nation as what is called treaty settlement land. We've made sure that this chapter is not just called the land chapter, as we want to ensure that everybody understands that the treaty is a lot more than just the pieces of land that are transferred to you. As I'll be discussing later, there are extensive rights to hunt, gather, fish, we hope, to participate in environmental assessment processes, to participate in the protecting of culture and heritage off treaty settlement land, to work in parks. All of these things will be happening off treaty settlement land. Treaty settlement land is not the whole package, it's part of the package. But of course, it's a very important part of the package. And I want to describe to you now what is in the treaty settlement land chapter. So the first part of the treaty settlement land chapter just describes what the lands are, and essentially what it says is that there's going to be a map, and the land shown on those maps, there's going to be one map for each nation, will in fact be the treaty settlement land for that nation. That is, if it's inside the map, regardless of who owns it, it is treaty settlement land. If it's outside the map, then it's not treaty settlement land. Second, the next important part of the treaty settlement land chapter describes how the First Nation owns the land and what ownership rights the First Nation has. And the basic rule is that the First Nation gets what I call fee simple plus. So fee simple is the legal type of ownership that's recognized in Western or English law, which is the highest possible form of ownership. It's really complete control of land. And the reason it's fee simple plus is that ordinary fee simple land, so land that would be owned off the reserves or off treaty settlement land, land that somebody like me might own in my home community, has a few things that are taken out of it and held back for the government. For example, mineral rights. Another example would be the right of the government to take back a certain amount of the land without compensating me for various purposes. In the case of your lands, in case of treaty settlement lands, the government has agreed that those exceptions will be taken out so that what you will get will be complete ownership. Now, some of you may ask, well, what does that mean about the land that I have now? What about my CP? What about the land that's held by my tenants? What about the right-of-ways that go through the reserves? The agreement that we've reached is that all of those things will be in some way or another continued so that nobody will lose what they have now. Either the rights will be continued as they were, or there'll be a replacement issued which will give them at least what they had before. So that the CP holders will get a land holding that's like CP's, leaseholders will get lease holdings that at least give them what they had before, and the right-of-ways that are necessary to get services and utilities onto your lands will still continue. But in order to avoid confusion, what's been agreed is that between the agreement in principle and final agreement, the governments and the First Nations, and this will involve the communities as well, will work together to develop a list of all of those matters. Those will be attached to the treaty, and anything that's in those lists will be continued, and anything not on those lists will come to an end. So there'll be no hidden interests, no hidden claims in the future. If it turns out that somebody is affected by this, because something wasn't continued, then it's going to be the responsibility of the federal government or provincial government to compensate them or make it right with them. It won't be the responsibility of your communities. The other thing that the First Nation will get that ordinary fee simple owners don't get will be the mineral rights under their land. So people who have mineral rights now will keep them, but the crown mineral rights, so mineral rights that haven't been staked or claimed by somebody else, will be transferred to the First Nations. In this area, probably the most important right will be gravel rights. Gravel is a major resource in this area, and those rights, subject to whatever interest the government has now, will in fact be transferred over to the First Nation, and the First Nation can use them to their benefit. Now, what about into the future? Well, one of the great things about treaty settlement land is that unlike reserve land, since you are an owner, you are able to transfer or sell or lease or rent the land directly to other people. So you will be able to move on and start doing economic development on a basis similar to the basis that ordinary people can do it, ordinary companies can do it, and start actually getting some benefit out of your land. You don't have to have your land frozen while we wait for the government to think about whether or not to let your community lease land for economic development, or to rent land out for economic development, or possibly even to sell land for economic development, in which case it would have come out of your reserves. Under the treaty settlement land system, your government, together with your people, can decide, for example, to sell land to other people, and it will still be treaty settlement land. This will mean that that land will still be under your governance system. It means that that land will still be subject to your nation's taxation system. It means that that land will still be subject to whatever protections there are in the treaty for treaty settlement land. So there is a system put in place that maximizes the ability of the First Nations to conveniently use their lands for economic development or for residential purposes, or to give your members ownership of land while still protecting the First Nations' rights to govern the land. The Treaty Settlement Land chapter also contains chapters or sections dealing with governance powers, so the power to zone land, to control nuisances, to expropriate land if necessary for public purposes, to control how the land that's controlled by the First Nation government is sold or leased. And all of these powers are designed to make sure that the First Nation's ability to exercise real governance powers over its land is protected. Now, there are some downsides to the Treaty Settlement Land chapter. First of all, the government still insists upon having the power to expropriate when necessary. However, compared to the Indian Act, which also allows expropriation, the expropriation sections that have been included in the Treaty Settlement Land chapter have a number of protections that are designed to make it very difficult for the government to expropriate, and to make sure that if they do decide to expropriate, it's only if strictly necessary and only to the extent that it's actually necessary to do so. It also makes sure that there is fair compensation paid, even if an ordinary person wouldn't be entitled to fair compensation. Also, if land is expropriated from the First Nation government, there are provisions that allow for replacement land to be given to the First Nation. So all of this is designed to maximize the chance that the First Nation will not be subject to expropriation, and if it is subject to expropriation, there will be fair compensation for everyone affected by the expropriation. Additionally, the provincial government has indicated, given the small amount of land that's being considered, that they will entertain the possibility of a cap on the total amount of expropriation available. Finally, there are several sections in the Treaty Settlement Lands chapter that deal with how to acquire future land. Many of these sections remain to be negotiated and largely suggest that between agreement in principle and final agreement, lists of land will be identified, which will be included in the treaty settlement land if certain circumstances arise. So that means we'll be able to acquire certain federal land, acquire certain provincial land, or if we're able to acquire certain private land, we can just add it to treaty settlement land. And there's a general agreement that if everybody agrees, provincial government, federal government, and local governments, then almost any land that is acquired can be added to treaty settlement land. So that's an overview of the Treaty Settlement Land chapter. One last thing to understand about the Treaty Settlement Land once you enter into treaty is that it will no longer be federal land for any purposes. This reflects the fact that the land is being transferred to your control and will be subject to the treaty rather than to the control of the federal government.